The year is 1937, and across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, millions of people are sitting down at kitchen tables, factory desks, and communal apartment corners to write letters that will destroy lives. They are not writing under duress. They are not being threatened or coerced. They are writing voluntarily, sometimes eagerly, to inform the state about their neighbors, colleagues, friends, and even their own family members. This is not the story of a surveillance apparatus forcing compliance through terror alone. This is the story of how an entire society learned to police itself, how ordinary people became the eyes and ears of totalitarianism, and how the Soviet state transformed denunciation from a shameful act into a civic virtue. To understand why millions of Soviet citizens willingly participated in this system of mutual surveillance and betrayal, we must first understand the ideological foundation that made such behavior not only possible, but morally justifiable in the minds of those who practiced it. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 did not merely overthrow a government, it promised to remake humanity itself, to create a new type of person freed from the corruptions of the old world. This new Soviet man would be selfless, devoted to the collective, and perpetually vigilant against enemies who sought to undermine the revolutionary project. From the earliest days of Soviet power, the regime cultivated an atmosphere of siege mentality. The young Soviet state faced genuine threats: foreign intervention during the Civil War, internal opposition from various political factions, economic sabotage, and the enormous challenge of transforming a largely agrarian empire into an industrialized socialist society. But beyond these real challenges, the Bolshevik leadership under Vladimir Lenin and later Joseph Stalin deliberately amplified the sense of danger, creating a political culture in which enemies were everywhere, hidden among the population, wearing the mask of loyal citizens while secretly working to destroy the revolution from within. The legal framework for denunciation was established early and codified systematically. The 1926 Criminal Code of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic contained a provision that would shape Soviet society for decades. Citizens could face imprisonment for failing to report reliable knowledge of a counter-revolutionary crime that was planned or had been committed. This was not merely a law on paper. It was enforced, publicized, and internalized. Every Soviet citizen understood that silence in the face of suspected wrongdoing was itself a crime. You were not merely permitted to inform on others. You were legally obligated to do so. The state had criminalized the ancient human instinct to mind one's own business. But the regime was careful to frame this obligation in positive terms. In official Soviet parlance, denunciations were not called denunciations at all. They were called signals. The language was deliberately chosen to evoke something helpful, necessary, even technical. A signal was information, data that helped the state function properly. Every citizen had a duty to be vigilant, to signal any suspicious persons in their midst to the law enforcement agencies. This linguistic reframing was crucial. It transformed what might otherwise be seen as betrayal into a form of civic participation, even patriotism. You were not betraying your neighbor. You were helping the state identify enemies who threatened everyone's safety and the success of the socialist project. The machinery of denunciation operated through multiple channels. The primary recipient of these signals was the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which served as the Soviet secret police. But denunciations could also be sent to party committees, workplace administrators, newspaper editors, and even directly to Stalin himself. The regime encouraged this multiplicity of channels, ensuring that there was always somewhere to send a complaint, always an authority willing to receive information about potential enemies. The system was designed to be accessible, even inviting. You did not need special training or authorization to participate. All you needed was paper, a pen, and suspicion. The content of these denunciations varied enormously, but certain patterns emerged. People were denounced for possessing forbidden literature, for expressing doubts about party policy, for having relatives abroad, for past association with the wrong political groups, for religious practice, for insufficient enthusiasm at political meetings, for listening to foreign radio broadcasts, for telling jokes about leaders, for hoarding food, for speculation in goods, for maintaining pre-revolutionary social connections, for speaking foreign languages too well, for traveling to the wrong places, for knowing the wrong people, and for countless other infractions, both real and imagined. The range of potentially criminal behavior was so vast that virtually anyone could be denounced for something. Many who wrote these denunciations did so with genuine conviction. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the system. These were not all cynical opportunists or malicious individuals. Many Soviet citizens, particularly those who came of age after the revolution, had internalized the regime's worldview so completely that they saw denunciation as a moral duty. They believed, sincerely and deeply, that they were protecting the revolution, defending socialism, and helping to build a better future. The propaganda was relentless and pervasive. From childhood, Soviet citizens were taught that vigilance was a virtue, that enemies were real and dangerous, that the party needed their help to identify threats. Schools, youth organizations, newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and literature all reinforced this message. The Young Pioneers, the Communist Youth Organization for children aged 9 to 14, explicitly taught children to be vigilant and to report suspicious activity. The Komsomol, the Youth League for those aged 14 to 28, made vigilance a central component of communist morality. The case of Pavlik Morozov became the most famous and most propagandized example of this vigilant youth. In 1932, 13-year-old Pavel Morozov from the village of Gerasimovka in the Urals allegedly denounced his father, Trofim Morozov, to Soviet authorities. Trofim, who served as chairman of the village Soviet, was accused of forging documents and helping kulaks, the supposedly wealthy peasants targeted for elimination during collectivization. Shortly after Pavel's denunciation, the boy was murdered, allegedly by family members seeking revenge for his betrayal. The exact details of what actually happened remain disputed by historians, with some suggesting the story was largely fabricated or heavily embellished by Soviet propaganda. But the historical truth mattered less than the mythological power of the story. The Soviet state transformed Pavlik Morozov into a martyr and a hero. Monuments were erected in his honor across the country. His story was taught in schools, books, poems, songs, operas, and films celebrated his supposed vigilance and willingness to place loyalty to the state above loyalty to family. The message was unmistakable. Even the bonds of blood should be subordinated to revolutionary duty. If a child could denounce his own father, then surely no relationship was sacred. No loyalty more important than loyalty to the party and the socialist state. The Pavlik Morozov cult reached its height in the 1930s and 40s, precisely the period when the terror was most intense and when the regime most needed citizens to inform on one another, and children learned the lesson. Young pioneer Mitya Gordienko from Rostov region informed on fellow villagers for collecting fallen ears of wheat in a collective farm field. This was during the implementation of the notorious Law of Three Spikelets, adopted on August 7, 1932, which decreed that theft of socialist property, including even small amounts of grain, could be punished by execution or 10 years in labor camps. Through the boys' denunciations, one arrested woman received a 10-year sentence in the camps, while her companion was shot. For this feat, Mitya was rewarded with a watch engraved with his name, a Young Pioneer outfit, and a subscription to the Lenin's Grandchildren newspaper. Young Pioneer Olya Balakina got 16 people put on trial for stealing and continuing to steal collective farm property. Pronya Kolybin, who denounced his own mother, was sent as a reward to Artek, the prestigious pioneer camp on the Black Sea coast. These were not isolated incidents. They were celebrated examples meant to inspire other children to similar vigilance. The psychological mechanism at work here is complex but comprehensible. Children in the Soviet Union were raised in a totalizing ideological environment. School curricula, youth organizations, public rituals, and family life were all permeated by party ideology. Children were taught that the party and the state represented the highest good, that Stalin was a wise and benevolent father figure, that enemies threatened the socialist homeland, and that vigilance was every citizen's duty. For children who fully internalized these messages, denouncing even a parent could seem not like betrayal, but like the highest form of loyalty. They were choosing the greater family, the socialist collective, over the smaller biological family. In their minds, they were heroes, but not all denunciations sprang from ideological conviction. The system was also exploited ruthlessly by those pursuing personal interests. Professional jealousy was a common motive. In workplaces across the Soviet Union, ambitious individuals used denunciations to eliminate rivals and advance their careers. The case of Ivan Benediktov illustrates both the danger and the occasional arbitrariness of the system. In 1937, Benediktov was a young, talented employee of the People's Commissariat for Agriculture. His competence and rapid advancement provoked envy among colleagues. A denunciation was written against him, signed by people he had considered close friends. The accusations reached Stalin himself. But Benediktov was fortunate. Stalin, recognizing his abilities and needing competent administrators during the massive upheaval of collectivization and industrialization, not only spared him but promoted him to People's Commissar for Agriculture. When Benediktov later saw the text of the denunciation and the signatures of his supposed friends, he was shattered. The betrayal was personal, but it was enabled and encouraged by a system that rewarded such behavior. Workplaces often had designated informers, individuals whose role was known or suspected by their colleagues. Nina Maltseva, who worked in Soviet media, later recalled the presence of such an informer in her editorial office, a man named Moiseyevich, who held the modest position of office manager but wielded disproportionate power through his connections to the NKVD. He was described as dim-witted, cocky, and sly, a man who took pleasure in the power he exercised, who poked his nose into everything and threatened everyone. Many lives and much human misery lay on his conscience, though, as Maltseva noted, he did not actually have a conscience. Such individuals existed in institutions throughout the Soviet Union, creating atmospheres of fear and suspicion that poisoned professional relationships and made genuine trust nearly impossible. Denunciations were also weapons in personal disputes. Neighbors in the cramped communal apartments that housed much of the urban Soviet population used denunciations to settle scores over shared kitchens, bathrooms, and living spaces. A neighbor could be denounced for possessing a portrait of Leon Trotsky, Stalin's exiled rival and the regime's most hated enemy. They could be denounced for conducting subversive activity at their collective farm, for expressing counter-revolutionary sentiments, for maintaining contact with relatives abroad, for any number of real or fabricated offenses. The denunciation offered a way to resolve disputes that had nothing to do with politics. If you wanted someone's apartment space, if you coveted their possessions, if you had a personal grudge, a well-crafted denunciation could eliminate your problem. The state would arrest your neighbor, confiscate their property, and you might even be rewarded for your vigilance. The rewards could be substantial. Financial compensation was offered for information leading to arrests. Promotions, better housing, access to scarce goods, and public recognition were all possible benefits of successful denunciation. The regime understood that ideology alone would not sustain the system. Material incentives were necessary to keep the denunciations flowing. At the same time, the law technically prohibited false accusations. The 1926 Criminal Code specified that knowingly false denunciations could result in imprisonment. But in practice, this provision offered little protection. During the height of the terror in the 1930s, the standard of proof was low, confessions were extracted through torture, and the definition of counter-revolutionary activity was so elastic that almost any accusation could be made to stick. Even if an initial denunciation proved baseless, the investigation itself often uncovered or manufactured other charges. The peak period for denunciations came during the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938. Though the system was well established before this and continued long after. During these years, the Soviet Union experienced a paroxysm of state violence, unprecedented in scale and intensity. Hundreds of thousands were executed, and over 1 million were sent to the Gulag labor camp system. The terror targeted party members, military officers, intellectuals, ethnic minorities, former kulaks, anyone with foreign connections, and vast numbers of ordinary citizens caught in the machinery of repression. Denunciations fueled this process. The NKVD had arrest quotas to fill, and denunciations provided the raw material. Each denunciation triggered an investigation. Each investigation required arrests. Each arrest required a confession. Each confession implicated others. The system fed on itself, expanding in ever-widening circles of accusation and counter-accusation. Konstantin Chernenko, who would later lead the Soviet Union briefly in the 1980s, once boasted that the party has a large army of voluntary informers at its disposal, that they had a complete picture about each and every person. This was an exaggeration, but it contained a core of truth. The system of mutual surveillance was so extensive, so deeply woven into the fabric of Soviet life, that it created a society in which privacy was nearly impossible and trust was a dangerous luxury. People learned to watch their words, to avoid expressing genuine opinions, to maintain a public face that conformed to official expectations while hiding their true thoughts. This culture of dissimulation and self-censorship became one of the defining features of Soviet life. The terror of the 1930s eventually subsided, not because the regime developed moral qualms, but because it had become counterproductive. Too many competent administrators, engineers, military officers, and party members had been arrested or executed. The economy and the state apparatus were suffering. Stalin himself pulled back, blaming the excesses on overzealous subordinates, though he had orchestrated the entire process. After Stalin's death in 1953, his successors, particularly Nikita Khrushchev, officially denounced the terror and released many prisoners from the camps. The system of denunciations declined in intensity, but it did not disappear. Throughout the remaining decades of Soviet power, from the 1950s through the 1980s, denunciations remained a feature of Soviet life. They were less likely to result in execution or long camp sentences, but they could still destroy careers, limit opportunities, and mark individuals as politically unreliable. People were denounced for reading samizdat, the self-published dissident literature that circulated underground. They were denounced for attempting to emigrate, for contact with foreigners, for religious activity, for insufficient political enthusiasm. The KGB, successor to the NKVD, continued to rely on a vast network of informers, both official agents and informal sources, who provided information about their fellow citizens. The precise number of denunciations written during the Soviet period remains unknown. Parts of the archives of the state security bodies remain closed even today, decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Historians have access to some materials, but many files are still classified or were destroyed. What is clear from available evidence is that the number was enormous, running into the millions over the 7 decades of Soviet power. Some individuals wrote hundreds of denunciations, becoming serial informers whose signals flooded the desks of security officials. One documented case from Moscow region involved a campaigner against corrupt practices who sent over 300 signals to various authorities. In the end, a large part of the allegations failed to be confirmed, but the sheer volume of accusations created work for investigators and cast suspicion on numerous individuals. The system created a society saturated with suspicion and fear. Trust became a scarce commodity. Friendships were shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. Family members wondered if their relatives might inform on them. Colleagues at work maintained careful distance, avoiding political discussions and personal revelations. The writer Nadezhda Mandelstam, widow of the poet Osip Mandelstam, who died in the Gulag, described Soviet life as one in which people learned to live with the constant awareness that anyone might be an informer, that any careless word might be reported, that survival required perpetual caution and self-censorship. This psychological burden was exhausting and corrosive. It undermined the possibility of genuine human connection and created a pervasive cynicism about official values. Yet the system persisted because it served the interests of the regime. It provided intelligence about potential opposition. It kept the population atomized and fearful, unable to organize collective resistance. It allowed the state to reach into every corner of society without maintaining an impossibly large official security apparatus. By making every citizen a potential informer, the regime multiplied its surveillance capacity enormously. The denunciation system was, from the perspective of the state, highly efficient. It outsourced repression to the population itself, turning ordinary people into the instruments of their own oppression. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought an end to the formal system of denunciations, but the legacy persists. Societies that experienced decades of mutual surveillance do not heal quickly. The habits of distrust, the instinct for self-censorship, the reluctance to speak openly about politics, or to trust strangers. These patterns of behavior were ingrained over generations. Post-Soviet societies have struggled with building civil society, establishing trust in institutions, and developing the kind of open public discourse that democracies require. The culture of denunciation left deep scars. Moreover, the historical memory of this period remains contested and incomplete. Some in Russia today view the Soviet period with nostalgia, remembering stability and superpower status while minimizing or forgetting the terror and repression. The archives remain partially closed. Full accounting for the victims has never been completed. Many perpetrators were never held accountable. The KGB officers, the interrogators, the informers most lived out their lives in comfort, their roles forgotten or deliberately obscured. This incomplete reckoning means that the lessons of the denunciation system have not been fully absorbed. The story of why people voluntarily denounced each other in the Soviet Union is ultimately a story about the malleability of human morality under totalitarian conditions. It demonstrates how ideology, when backed by state power and reinforced through every institution of society, can reshape moral intuitions and make the unthinkable seem normal, even virtuous. It shows how material incentives and personal grievances can exploit ideological frameworks for selfish ends. It reveals the fragility of trust and the ease with which societies can descend into mutual surveillance and betrayal when the state encourages and rewards such behavior. The Soviet system of denunciations was not an aberration or a uniquely Russian phenomenon. It was a logical outgrowth of totalitarian ideology and the technologies of modern state power. Its lessons remain relevant wherever governments seek to enlist citizens in surveilling one another, wherever ideology demands absolute loyalty, wherever the line between public duty and private betrayal is deliberately blurred. Understanding this history is essential not merely for making sense of the Soviet past, but for recognizing the warning signs when similar dynamics emerge in new forms and new contexts.